So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jihan Bergawi. I'm the head of the ACAPS Ukraine Analysis Hub. We do have simultaneous interpretation in both English and Ukrainian available, so please feel free to just follow along in whichever language that you feel most comfortable in. At the bottom, you should find an option to see which channel you'd like to follow. In the chat, we've also shared with you the Ukrainian translation of this presentation, so you can follow along. And I know that there was a question about the report link, so we'll share an updated link with you shortly. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today for this presentation. This really is the presentation of our flagship annual Ukraine scenarios report that we published about 2 weeks ago. And I'm happy to say that the Ukrainian version of that report was just finalized this morning, and it's now also available on our website, and it will be shared with you in the chat in a few minutes. Today's presentation is mostly going to be led by our senior analyst, Aditi Shetty. So before I hand over to her later on, I just want to go quickly through today's agenda. So we'll start off by really just doing a quick recap of what our scenario building methodology is to make sure that we're all on the same page, especially in terms of the terminology that Aditi is going to be using throughout the presentation. And then we will go through the process for how we actually built this year's scenarios. And then finally, Aditi is going to present our Ukraine scenarios for 2026 and their subnational implications in Ukraine. There will be plenty of time towards the end for questions, don't worry. So if you could be so kind as to just mute yourselves during the presentation itself, that would be really, really appreciated. And you can also type your questions into the chat for us to get to at the end if that's easier for you. But we will have an actual Q&A session to call on you. And then one last thing that I just want to mention. So our team is actually based in Kyiv. So in case there is any sort of air alert and we do have to run to the shelter, we may pause for just a few minutes and then pick it up from the shelter, but don't worry, it won't take too long because we're fairly close. Okay, so before we dive into the scenarios themselves, I just want to give a brief overview of who we are as an organization and what our expertise is in case this is your first time joining one of our presentations. So ACAPS is an international organization that provides independent analysis to support decision makers across the humanitarian sector to make better informed decisions and respond more effectively to crises around the world. And our hub in Ukraine was actually formed in March 2022, so shortly after the full-scale invasion. And since then, we've published a range of analytical products that can all be found on our website in both English and Ukrainian. So for example, we produce rapid analysis briefing notes that are triggered by or preceding major context shifts, especially along the front line. We also produce more in-depth thematic reports on cross-cutting issues that are based on needs or at partners' requests. So for instance, we published this report a few months back on the cross-sectoral role of mine action in Ukraine. This one was specifically requested by the Ukraine Ministry of Economy. And we also have a report that will actually be published at the end of this week on the impacts of the MENA conflict on Ukraine. So definitely do look out for that report. We also publish our humanitarian access analysis reports 3 times a year, and these ones do compare access challenges at the rayon level across Ukraine, including within the occupied territory. So separate to our regular analysis product and the accompanying data sets that we have on our website that we update on a monthly basis, we also have a growing capacity building portfolio that's aiming to transfer as many of our analysis skill sets into the hands of local organizations. Every year, we train hundreds of Ukrainian responders on how to use analysis in their day-to-day decision-making. So whether that's fundraising or strategic planning or programmatic design and even implementation. So to date, we've trained nearly 600 humanitarians and volunteers in Ukraine alone. And if any of this resonates with you and you'd like to receive our reports and invitations to any of the trainings or the workshops that we do, please do subscribe to our newsletter through the QR code that's on the slide. And don't worry, we'll also have it at the end as well. And lastly, as a global organization, ACAPS has really pioneered the use of foresight analysis in the humanitarian sector. So we've hosted scenario planning workshops for crises across the globe. So that includes Sudan, Afghanistan, the Middle East, and many other contexts. And the scenarios that Aditi is going to be presenting today are really the outcomes of the recent scenario workshops that we organized in Kyiv in February, which were the 4th annual scenario workshops our hub has led in Ukraine. Okay, so having said that, since we've got such a wide-ranging audience here, I think it's really important for us to first cover how ACAPS as an organization approaches scenario building before I then cover how we approach this process in the Ukraine context. So I'm going to start off with talking a bit more with the general theory first, before describing how we apply it to building the scenarios that Aditi is going to actually walk you through throughout the rest of the presentation. So to keep it simple, scenario building is just an analytical framework, or really a technique to help us think through hypothetical future conditions within a specific time frame. So that time frame itself can vary wildly depending on the purpose behind why you're creating scenarios. So it can be 2 weeks, it can be 6 months, it can be a year. I know there's a few think tanks in Europe that, for example, do scenario building over 20 years. I think the obvious caveat to this is that the longer the time frame, the less accurate your scenarios become. And so what is a scenario? So scenarios are simply evidence-based stories or narratives that are set in the future. I think there's this common misconception that scenarios are somehow accurate predictions of the future. I've been leading scenario workshops for the last decade in several different contexts. I can tell you that it's extremely rare, if not impossible, to be able to accurately account for every single plausibility. Like, there's simply too many factors that can impact the future. So I'm sad to tell you that you're not going to be leaving this specific webinar with a magic ball that can tell you exactly what's going to happen in Ukraine in 2026. I think if we had that ability as an organization, we're going to be playing a lot more lottery, but we still hope that this is going to be a useful exercise for you. The other limitation that we have with scenario building that makes this challenging is that beyond the amount of variables that can impact the future, the information that we actually and realistically have access to is also limited. So yes, Ukraine is the most information-rich humanitarian response in the world, but you do have to remember that we mostly have access to open source information. So we don't actually have access to intelligence. We don't actually know what different political figures or military leaders are going to do. We only know what they tell the media they will do, which, as we know, is not always accurate. But despite all of the weaknesses that I've just mentioned, the reason why scenario building is still really this valuable tool that we use is because it helps us to break the habit of assuming that the future is going to look exactly like the present. It also challenges our biases by making sure that we're not treating new information in terms of old beliefs, and it opens our mind to all of the different possibilities about the future. And in humanitarian settings, this is really, really important because it helps us to build strategies and programs that are much more resilient under different plausible conditions, even surprising ones. And it also helps us as a sector just be innovative and proactive, so rather than simply reactive to change. And I think 5 years on, there's really no excuse for us in Ukraine in particular to not be more proactive about contextual developments that we can just see coming down the line. And so there are various methodologies that you can use for scenario building. 3 of the most popular are the 2-axis method, the branch analysis method, and the chain of plausibility method. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the chain of plausibility method, or you can call it the cone of plausibility method because of this nice cone visual that it makes. But this is what we'll be using, in today's presentation, and what we use to build the scenarios during the workshops themselves. So the 2-axis method, I think you would have seen us deploy in our last cold season scenario report in case you're interested in that approach. But the reason why we use the chain of plausibility method is because it's a really helpful tool for short to medium term forecasting, especially when you have a multitude of factors that are impacting the future. So it allows you to come up with different scenarios that vary in terms of probability. So from probable, which is in the center of the cone that you can see here. And these are, the most likely to occur based on the current available information, all the way to plausible. So these are the futures that are outside the probable range, but they're still pretty consistent with what we know. To possible. And the possible range is going to include all of the scenarios that are unlikely to happen, but they may still occur under certain conditions. The key takeaway is that really the wider that you get from the center of the cone, the more preposterous the future that's represented becomes. So, for example, aliens invade planet Earth, and as a result, the war in Ukraine ends because all of the nations have decided to band together to fight off the alien invasion. So technically, the possibility of that scenario is not really technically zero, right? But it's also pretty unlikely given what we know now, or at least the available information that that we have access to. So we call those scenarios the wildcard scenarios. And so in our scenario building workshop, we actually try to avoid focusing too much on those. Otherwise, there's just no way for us to finish the scenario building process in time, because there's just, hundreds, if not thousands of plausibilities that you can consider otherwise. So what is important to remember is that the scenarios that we developed are distinctly different from each other. So otherwise, you're actually just describing different stages of one scenario. And we also try to open ourselves to scenarios that also have positive impact, as well as those that have a negative impact, because scenarios at the end of the day are meant to support preparation. So this is why we like to use this specific methodology. So for scenarios to be useful for our work within the humanitarian response in Ukraine, there's a few key principles that we do have to keep in mind. So first, scenarios are neither forecasts nor wishful thinking. So we have to acknowledge that as much as we'd like to, we don't have this magic ball in front of us that tells us everything, right? And therefore, we don't know with absolute certainty what will happen. And we're also not going to try to describe what we'll hope will happen, right? So that's the first principle. The scenarios also have to remain in that part of the cone that I've mentioned that is plausible. So it doesn't mean that we only deal with the scenarios that are the most likely to happen, but we are also excluding wildcards because, again, we can't possibly go through every single crazy thing that could happen. So the discussions that we had in our scenario workshops as we were building these scenarios, we're still trying to be as much as possible, challenging and thought-provoking, but we try to maintain the focus on, logical scenario building, and to try to be, focused on critical impacts that matter most to us as humanitarians. So we're not looking at every single thing that could happen in Ukraine, just what is relevant to the humanitarian response. And because there's countless possible futures, we also focus our attention on the dynamics and the drivers that matter most for humanitarian operations. So we really are trying to prepare, so we're not just trying to speculate endlessly. And then finally, scenarios are strongest when built with multiple perspectives in the room. So this is why we do workshops. I know from my own experience, some of the worst scenarios I've ever built were when I had to do them completely on my own, just locked up in my office, because none of us are so self-aware that we can spot all of our internal biases. And no actor and no organization, no matter how good the data that you collected, has all of the information needed for this process. So this is why, we do this in a really participatory process. The scenarios that we will be presenting to you today, are not owned by ACAPS, right? This is very much co-owned by the entire humanitarian response and all of the people that join us for those workshops. And this is what we really recommend if you ever want to do scenario building. Have as many perspectives as possible in the room to do that process with you. It certainly increases accuracy. So let's talk very quickly about some key terminology that we use in scenario building. It is a lot, but it will help as we dive deeper into the methodology itself and the scenarios that Aditi is going to be presenting. So in terms of variable, we use the word variable and factors interchangeably. So you'll kind of hear both terms being used, but they basically mean the same thing, right? It's just a factor that's considered to have a determining influence over the direction the future is going to take. I think the most important note here is that variables or factors are neutral themselves, but the direction that they take helps to shape our assumptions, which is that next term. And you'll hear Aditi use the term baseline assumptions quite a bit today, but by that we mean the direction that we're assuming a particular variable or factor is going to take. So for example, if let's say inflation is your variable, then your assumption is that inflation is going to continue to increase, right? So you kind of add a direction to it. And this part is really important because later on, Aditi will be going through some of the assumptions that we kept in mind when creating our preliminary scenarios. But really what I want you to understand is that if you think of the whole entire scenario building process as a house of cards, so the assumptions are the foundation. So if your assumptions are weak, all of your scenarios are going to be off. And this is really the major trap that I've seen the most experienced analysts fall into. They really just try to go straight into the scenario building and they skip this very critical step. So we're not amateurs, we're not going to do that today. So Aditi will actually take you through all of the baseline assumptions that we used when building the scenarios that we ended up coming up with towards the end of that process. And a trigger is an event or a condition that leads you into one of the scenarios. So I like to think of it as an if-then statement because it just makes it easier for me to remember this. So for example, if X happens, we're much more likely to be in scenario A. So a trigger is really kind of like a type of indicator, which is something that you're measuring and monitoring over time to help you assess the likelihood of a scenario taking place. But what differentiates triggers from other indicators is that if the trigger happens, you are almost certainly in one of the scenarios. So an indicator would be Russian attacks on energy infrastructure continue to increase. So this tells me that we're getting closer to an escalation scenario, right? It doesn't mean that we're automatically there, as we've all seen over the last couple of years, but it does mean that the likelihood of that particular scenario coming true has now increased. Whereas with a trigger, if you go back to this, if and then framing, so the trigger means that you're almost certainly in that scenario. So if there's a signed and ratified peace agreement, we've basically entered the cessation of hostilities scenario. I hope that makes sense. In terms of impact, I think these are pretty self-explanatory, but basically it's the overall effect of the scenario on people, society, livelihoods, services, and infrastructure. And then lastly, you've got compounding factor. So this is a significant event that would worsen the situation, and it really could happen in a combination for any scenario. So for example, a severe cold season, as we've just experienced, obviously makes any scenario that we come up with in Ukraine a lot worse off in terms of impact. So it doesn't matter, even if you're in a scenario in which there is a cessation of hostilities, having that cold season will still make the impacts worse off. So that's what that means. So that's some of the key terminology for you to keep in mind. I do realize it's a lot, it's quite technical, but hopefully it's going to start to make a lot more sense as we go through the rest of the presentation, and especially when Aditi starts to present the scenarios themselves. So how do we apply the chain of plausibility methodology? So as you can see here, it's a really, really involved process. So let's break it down for you just a bit. So first, we need to consider possible futures. So this is where we identify our research question and scope. We define the current situation, we identify variables, and you map the relationship between them, and then you start turning these into assumptions. So this process of defining the current situation is really informed by a deep and evolving understanding of the context, and it's supported by a significant amount of secondary data review, as well as targeted key informant interviews with experts. Next, we start to select relevant futures, and we develop mini scenarios as the basis from which to work. So these are the preliminary scenarios that we took to the workshops that we held in Kyiv in February. which is where we did step 7, developing the scenarios. Now I'm happy to say that we are, in the final phase of this process, where we finalized the scenarios already, and now we're just in the process of monitoring them to see which scenario that we end up in throughout the year. So this is where, the report publication and the monitoring of the context are really relevant for the utility of the scenarios themselves. And so let's just take a quick look about how this looks like in practice for us. So this is really a visual which represents how our scenario development process looks like in Ukraine. So this is actually the process that we undertook this year in developing the scenarios that Aditi is going to present. So despite the fact that the scenarios themselves are really only valid for this calendar year, so only for 2026, the work leading up to the workshops actually begins the year prior. So each annual workshop that we do builds on lessons learned from the workshops that came before it. So for example, given the really harsh winter conditions that I hope we're done with now, we really wanted our scenarios this year to just take into account how the intersection of war dynamics and seasonal conditions could actually drive very distinct cold season related needs across Ukraine. So last August, we produced our first ever cold season scenario report. And that analysis was then incorporated into this year's scenarios in the section called Compounding Factors. We also launched our Ukraine Context Analysis Dialogues last October, and these bring together academics and analysts from INGOs, UN agencies, and CSOs to just discuss emerging issues that are relevant to the Ukraine context together. So we held 3 dialogue sessions in Kyiv and Dnipro where we brainstormed together about cold season scenario impacts, all of the proposed peace plans that were on the table a couple of months ago, and we even worked together on defining the variables and the key factors that fed into the annual scenarios. So that is the laying the foundation stage. And that basically helps us to lay the groundwork for the next stage, which is the secondary data review and key informant interviews that we did to produce the preliminary report. So Aditi is going to go over that in more detail, but what's important to note is that this stage helped us not only fact check our own baseline assumptions, but also triangulate and verify the information that we came up with. We then took the preliminary scenarios to the first scenario building workshop that was held in Kyiv on February 19th. So that first workshop was a closed discussion amongst a small group of experts with representation from 15 different organizations with expertise in context analysis, data collection, displacement analysis, and humanitarian needs assessment. And really, we spent a full day together just developing the preliminary nationwide scenarios in a lot more detail and just exploring how each scenario is likely to play out at the subnational level within Ukraine. And the reason for this is because Ukraine as a context is just way too big for nationwide scenarios that can actually be useful for decision makers. So for example, the way that conflict escalation looks like is going to be really, really different in how it plays out in the front line than it would in Kyiv or even in Western Ukraine. So we really wanted to make sure that all of these variances are reflected in the analysis that we've produced. And this is also reflected in the report itself. We then took the outcomes of that first workshop to a second scenario validation workshop. And this one was also held in Kyiv on the 25th of February, but with a much wider audience, including country directors from most major INGOs and CSOs, donor representatives, cluster coordinators, and experts from UN agencies and humanitarian coordination forums, totaling 27 different organizations. So it was this workshop where we validated the scenarios from the first workshop, and then we really just fleshed out more of the humanitarian and operational impact of each scenario. So ultimately, the insight from this entire process and the workshops are just reflected in the scenario report that we published at the end of March. And one final step that is actually not included in here, but I wanted to highlight is that in May, we and our colleagues from INSO in Ukraine are also going to run 5 joint contingency planning workshops in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, and Odessa throughout the month. So please do look out for an invitation from INSO for these workshops. We piloted this last year quite successfully, and we just found that it's a really great way to make sure that people use the scenarios that we've produced for their own preparedness rather than just reading the report once and forgetting about it until one of the scenarios eventually happens. All right, so now in the interest of time, I'm going to hand over to Adichie, who's actually going to take you through the scenarios themselves. Over to you, Adichie.
Great. Thank you for walking us through that general process, Jihan. I think it's really helpful to ground everyone in how we actually got to the scenarios themselves, because otherwise I think there's a risk that people think that we just came up with it out of nowhere. So just by way of introduction again, my name is Aditi Shetty. I am one of the senior analysts in the Ukraine Analysis Hub at ACAPS. I'm based in Kyiv, and so really, I'm the lead analyst on our scenarios work, and I'm really excited to walk everyone through how we got to the scenarios and, of course, the scenarios themselves. And so that's what's going to really take us through the rest of the presentation. So really, when we started this process, we started with a very broad research question in terms of thinking about possible scenarios for Ukraine. And it seems like a very simplistic question, but obviously it's a very big one, which is what could happen in Ukraine in 2026? Now, obviously, this is the kind of question that could lead you to 100 different scenarios for how things could play out. So we have to try to break this question down so that we can develop, as Jihan mentioned, a limited but diverse set of scenarios that would be relevant for humanitarian decision makers in particular. So I want to emphasize here that it's important for scenarios to be divergent enough to allow us to think about different plausible futures in a meaningful way. Scenarios aren't too helpful when you have too many of them or they look too similar to each other. So again, the point is not to identify every possible thing that could happen, but to use the scenarios as a tool to think about operational and programmatic outcomes and decisions. So keeping that in mind, how did we actually start to refine our question? So as Jihan mentioned earlier, we've been working on the scenario process for quite a while, both in our ongoing reporting and analysis, but also those context analysis dialogues that we had in the past few months. And that all helps to really build upon what we already know, but also to test and refine our analysis. And we also limit the scope to 2026 because, for one, this is a yearly exercise for us, but two, and more importantly, is that the context could change significantly by 2027. So our overall scope and research question deliberately starts fairly broadly so that we're looking at the whole of the context to begin with, but then we start to narrow it down in terms of scope in a number of ways. So this is one way in which that looks. So after some initial scoping in January, we began defining and mapping the variables that are relevant in Ukraine. And as you can see, there are a lot of factors to consider. So they include variables like mobilization, Ukrainian and Russian military capabilities, and foreign support for Ukraine, but also factors like the role of advanced weaponry, climate variability, and labor market constraints. So you can see that we cover a range of different variables and factors, and it's quite a lot to try and make sense of. So this is where our dialogue session in Dnipro, which we held in January, was really critical because it allowed us to work with context and humanitarian operational experts to surface the salient contextual drivers in 2026. So the most influential or consequential factors that were identified were the war and security dynamics, the Ukrainian economy, domestic politics, peace talks, impacts on critical infrastructure, and foreign aid to Ukraine. So you can see that from this really wide range of factors and variables that we start to narrow some of this down. And once we identified those key factors, this is where additional data review, including of scenarios that other organizations had developed, and key informant interviews with experts helped us to test and refine our assumptions leading up to the workshops. And this is effectively to triangulate and validate our work as we go. So what this allowed us to do is to build out some of the key assumptions and drivers behind the scenarios. So we did 8 targeted interviews with experts from different sectors and a wide range of expertise, including from think tanks and academia. And this is really a continuous and iterative process that not only allows us to develop our thinking with the benefit of expert insight on, say, conflict dynamics or the energy sector, for example, but also to assess and analyze the information rather than taking it at face value. So it is really a process of regular triangulation and verification. But what I think is really key here that emerged from all of this work that we've covered is that the humanitarian crisis and many of the factors identified, be it the economy or the critical infrastructure, really depend on the evolution and outcome or conclusion of the war. So this interplay between military developments and political negotiations is really what will drive how the conflict situation will evolve and what that will mean for people. And that's really what shapes the scenarios that we end up with. So, for example, even economic scenarios that I looked at, that looked at GDP growth or inflation rates, for example, are built around assumptions of the trajectory of the war. So in that sense, I don't think we're operating on a different basis from the scenarios we built last year in terms of our understanding of what the main driver of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is, which is the war. So this is what allows us to refine our research questions so that we're moving towards developing a manageable number of scenarios that are relevant for our purposes. And this is also what differentiates our scenarios from others that you might see, whether other think tanks or organizations are producing them, is precisely because our research question, what we're trying to answer, is fundamentally different and focused on the humanitarian angle. So ultimately, we land on this as the research question at the very end. So how could the development of the conflict influence the humanitarian situation and response in Ukraine through 2026? You can see that it's still a bit broad, but has been narrowed down in scope quite a bit. So if you think about the previous research question, where we just asked this general question of what will happen in Ukraine in 2026, it is the kind of question that could lead us to developing scenarios that perhaps have very little to do with the war at all. And therefore, you create the risk that you develop scenarios that aren't relevant for the humanitarian response in Ukraine. But because we're developing a humanitarian focused set of scenarios, our research question has to come from that point of view. So namely, how do developments in Ukraine affect people on the ground? And for humanitarian purposes, it means that the war and its evolution are the most important determinants of the trajectory of the humanitarian situation, as well as the response to it. Now, Jihan has mentioned baseline assumptions, and so I'll go over that here very quickly, which is baseline assumptions are a really critical element to building scenarios because they really are the logical and analytical backbone of the scenarios themselves. So I want to spend some time here going through what they are, but I just want to mention that, again, these assumptions were developed based on our analysis, secondary data review, and key informant interviews. So they do reflect broader thinking, not just what our own assumptions as ACAPS are. But really, I want to cover them because this is really what underpins the scenarios that we came away with. So despite ongoing political negotiations brokered by the US, the shape of any potential peace plan remains highly uncertain. Again, we don't know the contents of what is being discussed, just what's being reported publicly. And it's also hard to discern how serious these discussions actually are for the parties involved. But fundamentally, I want to come back to a really critical point, which is what we're also seeing play out in real time these days, which is that diplomacy is quite meaningless without actual fighting ending, and we've seen this time and time again in various contexts, including Ukraine, certainly. At the same time, fundamental positions between the negotiating parties remain unchanged. So Russia's maximalist goals remain unchanged in terms of its position on Ukraine, while Ukraine's positions on questions of its sovereignty, territory, and security are also unchanged. And that means that a full cessation of the war is less likely in 2026. Russian domestic military industrial production will continue to increase. We've seen that it's a pretty integral part of its war effort, given what we've seen over 2025 and into 2026 in terms of the intensified aerial strikes across the country. And we expect this to continue, not least because domestic production forms a very significant part of the Russian economy. And on a related note, We've seen a Russian economy increasingly under pressure. So the economy has mobilized completely around the war effort. Inflationary pressures remain, and Ukraine continues to target nodes of Russia's economic infrastructure, so oil refineries, for example. And all of this, together poses challenges for Russia's revenue streams. And under most circumstances, we would probably expect an economic collapse soon. But the Russian economy has been quite resilient, and the analysis points to the fact that it's not likely to threaten Moscow to alter course on the war in the near term. So it doesn't seem like there are really internal or external levers that would move the Russian position on the war. And I've seen some analysts even suggest that Russia could continue the war in Ukraine for another 2 years at least. I do want to say that with the latest developments in the Middle East, it might provide Russia with a short-term buffer, whether because Western attention is focused elsewhere or because increased oil revenues could support the Russian economy to some extent. But I think this picture is a bit more complex than we can cover here today. As Jihan mentioned, we are working on a short report to be published in the coming days that looks into some of these downstream impacts for Ukraine. So I won't cover it too much right now for time. But I do want to cover two other points, which is despite ongoing political and military challenges, Ukraine is unlikely to face a massive political or military collapse. It would be one of those wild card situations that Jihan was referencing earlier. And both parties will continue facing challenges on the battleground, but the technological and industrial development for both parties will also affect these battlefield dynamics. So the point here is that it's not likely that Russian forces will be able to make a significant and rapid gain, short of some kind of tactical error or collapse on the Ukrainian side. And that's because of their own operational constraints and limitations. And while Ukraine is outnumbered in terms of supplies and people power, it is increasingly fighting a technological war that may at least allow it to avert a complete military collapse. We also know that Western partner countries play a huge role in the trajectory of the war. US support in particular has evolved since last year, and it continues to provide Ukraine with critical aid in terms of intelligence and weapons, though obviously reduced and through different modalities than the direct support it provided before. So the NATO PURL scheme is one of these mechanisms, but again, it doesn't fundamentally change the reduced scope of US assistance to Ukraine over the past year or so. There are also election-related pressures and other tensions in Europe, primarily economic, that could threaten support to Ukraine. So we just saw the outcome of the Hungarian elections, though it's too early to really tell what this means for Ukraine. And we also have elections next year in France and Germany as well. But overall, none of this is likely to threaten broad-scale European support for Ukraine in 2026. We see that there's war fatigue among Ukrainian civilians, particularly given the cold season that we all just experienced, as well as other political scandals and tensions. And while there is overall war weariness in Ukraine, Ukrainian resolve in general remains quite strong, and this is based on some of the polling data that's available. Elections are a question that come up a lot. Again, they're unlikely to happen in 2026 during wartime without constitutional changes or the end of martial law. Any constitutional changes would face legislative barriers, certainly, but would also, based on polling data, be quite unpopular among the general public. And so that's a pretty big barrier to climb in terms of trying to host elections while the war is going on. Demographic and economic challenges will intensify after any cessation of hostilities. So issues like mobilization, labor shortages, inflation, all of these issues will continue and won't just go away once the war is over, and will be extremely relevant in thinking about stabilization and reconstruction, for example. But we also see that there are more structural challenges for Ukraine emerging in terms of currency devaluation and gaps in external financing. And we covered some of that in our USAID report that we published in December. But speaking of structural challenges, given what we've seen over the past few months and even the past year, and based on what emerged from our discussions with experts, the energy and transport sectors are emerging as structural vulnerabilities for Ukraine beyond mere repairs and restoration of capacity. And so this will be really critical to think about in 2026. As I wrap up this part of the presentation, you'll note that this is not an exhaustive list of assumptions about every single variable influencing the situation in Ukraine. I'm sure there are some factors that others are considering in terms of a direct NATO-Russia engagement or the death of some key figure in government. You'll notice that they're not reflected in our baseline assumptions or scenarios because either they're cross-cutting and not a direct driver of a scenario, or because they're high impact but low probability events that we wouldn't actively plan around. Of course, I should mention that one key assumption we haven't baked in is US foreign policy positioning on Ukraine, which I think has been characterized more recently by sometimes sudden and significant shifts that are just really hard to anticipate and plan around. So I want to name that up front as a key assumption we haven't factored in because it's actually quite difficult to build any meaningful assumptions around. I also want to note that there was quite broad agreement on these assumptions in both of our workshops, which is really critical because they reflect a deep contextual knowledge that's validated with experts. And as I said, they're the underpinning logic of the scenarios, which is what I'll present now. So what I'll do is I'll give you a top-line summary of each of the scenarios before going into more detail. But just to say, if you're familiar with our 2025 scenarios, the names of the scenarios haven't changed from last year, largely because our preliminary analysis led us to similar general scenarios from 2025, because again, they rest on this fundamental question of how the war will evolve. But of course, these scenarios also take into account the many changes in the context since a year ago. So overall, we have three scenarios that we landed up with. As in the report, they're listed here in order of probability based on both our analysis as well as the inputs from the two workshops. So scenario one is a scenario of continued war without resolution, or what we call the status quo scenario. But when we say status quo, we don't mean that nothing new will not happen. We're still seeing a very kinetic but slow-moving conflict in frontline areas, as well as the continued evolution of long-range aerial strikes across Ukraine. In this scenario, negotiations continue, but the talks themselves don't actually materialize into any agreement, and so the overall trajectory of the conflict itself does not change. Our second scenario looks at a reduction of hostilities, where there's some kind of ceasefire or localized truce that lowers the intensity of the conflict as a precursor to and while negotiations for a more comprehensive agreement and settlement continue. But this is still a tenuous and unstable de-escalation of sorts. And lastly, we have an escalation scenario where Russia breaks through the relative stalemate and the front lines shift significantly, while the targeting of critical infrastructure also intensifies. Now, obviously, given how large a country Ukraine is and the distinct dynamics that each of these scenarios would have in different parts of the country, it doesn't make sense to limit our scenarios to just the macro level descriptions of what might happen. It wouldn't be particularly useful for operational and strategic planning within the response. So our scenarios also describe how these macro level dynamics will play out within Ukraine itself. And so the regional breakdown we have closely follows the coordination system in Ukraine. So we have the East region, the South region, and then the sort of North, Central, West conglomerate, as I call it. So in terms of scenario one, this macro level scenario, we still see slow moving front lines with more local offensives and counteroffensives taking place concentrated in eastern and southern oblasts. But really, neither side achieves a decisive breakthrough here. And importantly, access to occupied areas remains highly restricted. We do see that the technological adaptations on both sides continues, but it doesn't change the overall balance. It rather expands insecurity beyond the front line, which is really critical for thinking about risks to civilians. We do also see persistent Russian long-range strikes on a variety of Ukraine's critical infrastructure as well as major population centers. And again, this is the sort of expansion of insecurity beyond immediate frontline areas, even within the status quo scenario. At the same time, Ukraine's political focus remains on defense and survival. So elections don't are unlikely to take place, but if they were to take place, they would prioritize wartime leadership. And at the same time, we see that anti-corruption and other governance reforms continue to be delayed by the demands of war and continued insecurity. In this scenario, we also see that Western support remains strong, but again, is subject to political and economic uncertainty. We've already seen some of this play out, certainly. And we also see that Ukraine's economy faces continued pressures, and the budget deficits certainly persist. And so all of that increases this reliance on external financing and a dependence on international aid. Livelihoods become a nationwide concern, not just limited to frontline areas, particularly because households are increasingly relying on last resort savings, particularly given employment instability and rising costs that are compounding economic pressures. Ukraine continues decentralizing its energy system, but structural vulnerabilities do remain, and ongoing infrastructure attacks contribute to uneven service delivery across regions. And while we see that large-scale national displacement has ended, localized and cyclical movement does continue. And returns to higher risk areas do increase, driven by a number of different factors. But I think the point here is that we see that vulnerability expands across the range of Ukrainian society, not just in frontline areas. So what does this mean regionally speaking? So again, I'll keep this quite high level, just noting that there's much, much more detail in the actual report itself. But eastern Ukraine remains the main area of active fighting, where front lines advance slowly and with no decisive breakthrough. But again, this ongoing insecurity and these expanded drone strikes and the strikes on major supply routes do keep humanitarian needs high while further constraining humanitarian access and aid delivery in particular. And displacement, when we think about it, is mostly limited to within the eastern region, while large-scale westward movement remains limited. In the south, which really encompasses Odessa, Khersonska, and Mykolaievska oblasts, we see that Khersonska faces the highest levels of insecurity, again, given the expansion of drone capabilities, while Mykolaievska and Odessa oblasts remain a bit more stable, although in Odessa in particular, the attacks on ports and bridges do disrupt local economies. And finally, in the center, west, and north, the northern border oblasts, so Sumska and Chernihivska oblasts, do face ongoing insecurity and cyclical displacement, while central and western regions serve as the main hosting, logistics, and institutional backbone of the country and certainly the humanitarian response. But again, we see a growing strain from prolonged war and the increasing reliance of IDPs in particular on hosting communities and local resources. So that really summarizes scenario one, but I want to start moving to scenario two, which is this reduction of hostilities. And again, there are many mechanisms by which a reduction of hostilities can take place. So, a partial or localized ceasefire even could reduce large-scale offensives, but again, it doesn't end the war. And that means that violations remain frequent, access to occupied areas still remain highly restricted, and both sides use the pause to strengthen their defensive position, certainly, while mobilization does continue to take place. So again, even in a reduction of hostilities scenario, we see that this isn't really a full end to the war, and certainly some of the dynamics shaped by that. We see that in this case, civilian casualties do decline compared to scenarios 1 and 3, but fewer attacks, it doesn't necessarily mean improved security for people. So while attacks on major energy infrastructure do decrease, limited public finances and structural weaknesses really do constrain recovery in this regard. And that, of course, leads to uneven service delivery, for example. Reconstruction progresses slowly, again, because of the continued insecurity, and humanitarian funding declines as the situation is seen as less urgent. And so that shifts responsibility more towards the state and other actors, despite ongoing fiscal and capacity gaps that we've noted in some of our other analysis. Again, displacement slows overall and selective returns do occur, but mostly driven by economic need. So that's something to think about in terms of the dynamics of population movements. Moderate returns from abroad too take place, but the pressure on jobs, on housing increases social tensions in areas where we do see many more returnees. Mine contamination in particular becomes a major barrier to safe return and agricultural recovery. And demining, again, remains insufficient at scale. So we do see some of the implications for agriculture and livelihoods in particular. In a reduction of hostility scenario, going back to the point I made about social and economic and political tensions persisting, social cohesion really comes under strain here, given debates around accountability, negotiations, elections, military strategy. You really see that coming up more to the surface. And so political polarization does increase. And we also see more informal economies rising, given the slow recovery in some parts of the country. And so in that sense, economic recovery is uneven. We see larger and more diversified cities rebound faster, while frontline and border areas remain more marginalized, while broader macroeconomic conditions like inflation and currency devaluation certainly contribute to that pressure. And one thing I do want to mention here in particular is this idea of the reintegration of veterans as well as broader psychosocial needs and the state of social protection across the country. I think challenges in all of these areas certainly become more visible sources of longer term strain, even in a reduction of hostilities scenario. So in terms of the regional sort of breakdown, we see that, again, the East would experience fewer large-scale offensives, but there is still instability given ceasefire violations, for example. And in the East, we see that household needs remain among the highest in the country, especially for protection, livelihoods, and psychosocial support. The 0 to 5 kilometer zone would remain largely inaccessible here, while access would gradually improve, say, in the 5 to 10 kilometer zone. But again, access remains highly restricted. It's not that it would improve immediately necessarily, given the tenuous nature of the overall conflict situation here. The South does see some stabilization, but again, there are persistent risks given insecure front lines and slow demining, but there are small and gradual improvements in humanitarian access, energy, and financial trade, for example. So the economic recovery, while it does accelerate to some degree, it is concentrated in coastal and trade-focused areas, while rural and frontline adjacent communities do fall behind, particularly those that are dependent on agriculture. And in the center, west, and north, again, volatility remains high in the northern border oblasts, while displacement remains concentrated among groups like older people or low-income households who have pre-existing vulnerabilities, while central and western regions move more towards a cautious stabilization, while they do manage longer-term displacement that becomes a bit more structural in nature. And so because many of those IDPs do settle permanently in their hosting communities, the economic and demographic changes in the country do become slightly more long-term. And then lastly, in a scenario of escalating war, we see that a large-scale Russian offensive drives territorial gains concentrated in eastern oblasts and along key transport routes, while repeated attacks on energy and other infrastructure deepen blackouts, disrupt mobility, and increase public health risks. So we see the sort of knock-on effects of the strikes on critical infrastructure in terms of cascading humanitarian needs for people. So we see civilian casualties rise sharply, as well as surging internal displacement, which isn't exclusively driven by frontline movement, but also by infrastructure collapse and broader insecurity. while disruptions to energy, food security, food storage, and transport do create localized pockets of food insecurity while worsening winterization and protection challenges. Broadly speaking, we see that military spending increases, which again slows economic growth and reduces the resources available for social and civilian services, particularly as the economic challenges do persist across the country. And at the same time, we see that both sides do intensify their military efforts, whether it's on mobilization or domestic military production. But at least in Ukraine, not only does martial law remain in place, but certainly it becomes tighter given the escalation we're describing. NATO and EU military support certainly rises, but US assistance remains politically dependent on a number of factors. But again, this overall trend towards increased defense spending outweighs the money available for humanitarian aid, while humanitarian needs are growing sharply and preparedness and pre-positioned resources are insufficient. So this scenario would again see the balance tilting towards a very emergency-driven response. Elections are postponed, but short-term wartime unity temporarily masks the political polarization and divisions. And so again, you see this tension sort of emerging throughout each scenario. In terms of thinking about returns from abroad, we see that temporary protection for Ukrainians is extended, but different pathways for asylum and resettlement may tighten or even shift, which might shape some of the dynamics in terms of refugee settlement and returns. Nuclear risk remains low, but I think persistent instability around nuclear facilities increases anxiety and could drive panic-driven displacement beyond just the sort of actual insecurity that's driving it. And really, I think the main message here is that the chronic exhaustion in this scenario starts to set in, given the infrastructure degradation, the economic hollowing out of frontline regions in particular, and the sort of regional inequalities that are deepening. So in terms of the East, we see again that this is the main focus of escalation, but humanitarian access contracts sharply while displacement surges. And again, repeated strikes on infrastructure weaken both civilian resilience and the operational capacity. And mass displacement from northern Donetsk Oblast is likely, with secondary movements from Kharkivska and Zaporizhzhia Oblasts, with a particular impact for transit hubs and collective sites and shelters. And again, while the short-term societal unity rises, there's a longer-term fatigue that sets in. The South faces growing instability even without major ground advances, and we see this because of long-range strikes, damaged infrastructure, and economic pressures that all start to coincide. We see that strikes intensify in Mykolaievska and Odessa oblasts, while, of course, the situation in Khersonska Oblast and Kherson in particular remains quite intense. In the center, west, and north, we see northern border oblasts face increased shelling and damage, which accelerates population movements elsewhere, and previously stable regions in the center and west experience intensifying secondary stress given ongoing displacement, infrastructure attacks, and economic shocks that are basically ripple effects from the east. So that is a lot of information to cover. I'll just say that there's much more detail in our scenario report. But as I start to sort of wind down here, you might be asking the question of, okay, you've covered all of this, but what's more likely to happen? That's a question we get pretty much all the time. So one clear outcome from the two workshops is that scenario one, which is our sort of status quo scenario, seems the most likely. Now, how do we know this? This is a poll that we conducted in both of our scenario workshops. So the humanitarian and data and context experts in both workshops were clearly thinking that, scenario one is the most likely outcome of the three that we've described. And as you can see, they're much more split on scenario 2 or 3. So one thing I will say is, we can move from one scenario to another, say a reduction of hostilities that gives way to an escalation. But how do we actually tell which scenario we're heading towards? So Jihan mentioned this when she was talking about the terminology, but we do cover this in the report. So at the end of the report, we have a chart that identifies both indicators and triggers for each scenario that will help you and your organizations track the direction of travel and understand which scenario we're in. So even if right now, scenario one, the status quo seems the most likely, we do have a framework for monitoring the context and seeing which scenario we're actually shifting towards as the context evolves. As we wrap up, I also wanted to preview our next report coming out in the next couple of days, since I know this is of interest to quite a few people. We've referenced it a bit earlier, but I do want to preview some of the key findings for you here. So this report on the impacts of the 2026 Middle East conflict on Ukraine, it really looks at the most immediate and consequential of these impacts from a humanitarian perspective. So it's not an exhaustive analysis of all of the issues, certainly, but some of the ones with key and more immediate humanitarian implications. So it covers four sort of central themes here that I'll outline. So first is this increasing military asymmetry, where the disruptions to interceptor supplies are constraining Ukraine's air defense at the same time that Russia has increased its weapons production to sustain large-scale aerial attacks. Another really sort of immediate impact is stalled diplomacy, while diplomatic attention has shifted away from Ukraine. And of course, there's this question around some of Russia's improved fiscal conditions that might reduce its incentive to negotiate or end the war. Another key implication is on the energy system. So we see that the Middle East conflict has contributed to higher global energy prices. That specifically has impacts for European countries on which Ukraine depends for energy imports. And so given the increasing costs and some of the other sort of sectoral challenges in the energy realm, this is of particular importance during this really critical recovery window for Ukraine ahead of the next winter and cold season. And then lastly is the impacts to agriculture and the overall economy. So we see that fertilizer and fuel price increases have the likelihood of disrupting the current planting season, which could contribute to inflation and certainly food price increases in Ukraine, at least in the next 3 to 6 months. So that all of that sort of links together to shape humanitarian impacts, including increasing civilian exposure to aerial strikes, greater disruptions to electricity, water, and health services driven by challenges in the energy system, rising food and fuel prices that reduce household purchasing power, and of course, in general, increased humanitarian needs, and of course, higher response costs. And in terms of the outlook, I really want to summarize it in one short sentence, which is that these impacts are really likely to persist over the next 3 to 6 months, even with an end to the Middle East conflict, just because of how global level disruptions to oil markets, for example, work. And so even if the Middle East conflict ended tomorrow, we would still see some of these impacts play out for Ukraine in the next 3 to 6 months. And so that's really the main message of that report. But again, it will have more analysis and more detail when we publish it in the next coming days. But that's really what I wanted to preview here, because I think it's a quite pertinent question as we're thinking about the scenarios themselves and their implications. So as we wrap up, I just want to say that I hope this presentation was a useful overview of the scenarios and how we developed them, and that the report, again, will contain much more detail about their contextual and humanitarian dimensions than we can cover in a session like this. So with that, I would like to turn back to Jihan and open up the Q&A here.
Thank you, AG, for the really thorough presentation. So we can either call on you if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to instead put your question in the chat, that also works for us. And feel free to ask your question in either language that you feel comfortable in. Maybe Adichie, as we wait on people to write their questions if they have any. Oh, we have our first one. Ludmila, please.
Hello, everybody. Hello, dear colleagues. I haven't a question, but I want to say gratitude words. I know which this difficult work created of different scenarios, provide analysis context, and thank you so much from our hearts for your productive and interesting and useful work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
That's really kind of you. Thank you.
Any other questions or feedback or comments? Okay, so I guess while there's a question in the chat, how we could subscribe to your announcement. So we will put the links up towards the end, and maybe we can also add that in the chat here so that you can subscribe to our newsletter and get the information directly in your inbox. But as we wait for additional questions, Adichie, I talked a lot about the chain of plausibility approach earlier in the presentation. So can you talk maybe about some of the other methodologies for scenario building that we've used, and in what instances you would use a different methodological approach than the chain of plausibility method?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are different methodologies for scenarios, and certainly the one that we've used here, I think applies to this question that we're looking at in terms of what might unfold from a humanitarian perspective in Ukraine in 2026. But the other methodologies are really useful. And again, I want to bring it back to what is the specific question you're trying to answer and what is the specific context you're looking at. So I'll mention a couple here that we covered in the presentation briefly. So the two-axis method and then the branch method. So the two-axis method is best for when uncertainty is structured around two dominant drivers that are independent of each other. So you wouldn't pick two factors that are closely related to each other necessarily, but you really want them to be completely separate so that you still end up with distinct scenarios here. And what's nice about the two-axis method is you pit these two independent factors against each other, and then you end up with a sort of 2x2 matrix in which you end up with four really clearly distinct scenarios. And why the two-axis method is useful is it can help promote thinking beyond a clear linear pathway, and it can help focus prioritization around the highest impact and highest uncertainty drivers in the particular situation you're looking at. So again, we use this two-axis method when we were looking at the cold season scenarios because the two high impact, high uncertainty drivers are the extent of damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure resulting from Russian attacks, and then the severity of the cold season. So how cold is it likely to get, what the weather conditions might actually be. And when you put those two against each other, you end up with these very four clear scenarios that unfold in different ways. The one challenge with the two-axis method is that it can also oversimplify multivariable crises when the reality is perhaps a bit more complex. But again, because scenarios are a framework for looking at how the future might unfold, it's still quite useful in that context. The branch method is useful when you have, it's like a decision tree. So when you have a sequence of decision points or trigger events that create branching futures. So I've used this when I was building scenarios around the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, because it basically hinges on the question of will it fail or will it succeed, and then, what the scenarios might be. So I find that helpful when you're doing really near-term planning, but again, it can also imply false predictability or linearity. So all of that is to say there are clearly benefits and also some limitations to each of these methods. But I think the method that you select really depends on the question you're trying to answer and the context you're looking at.
Thank you for that. No, I totally agree. And I would also add that I think in practice, sometimes Aditi and I don't always know which methodology we're going to use until we're in the midst of the scenario building. And then we're like, wait, the scenario methodology is no longer working for us. Let's try something else. So that also does tend to happen. We do have a question in the chat. How do you think the humanitarian access zone is going to change by the end of 2026? So will it expand due to advances in Russian military technology, or will it shrink due to improvements in the Ukrainian side's interception capability?
Sorry, is this a question around access in occupied territories? I might have missed a part of the question.
Yeah, so how do you think the humanitarian access zone will change by the end of 2026? So I assume access from the Ukrainian side. So will it expand due to advances in Russian military technology? Did we understand your question correctly, or would you like to just provide a bit more information, Mikola? Okay, I will assume that is what that is the question.
So maybe I'll try and answer it in a sort of general, sort of contextual way, and then come to the very obvious conclusion that it depends on which scenario plays out and how it plays out in the specific region you're looking at. But we have seen the sort of expansion of the quote unquote kill zone, for example, in the gray zone. I think one of the lessons about access is, yes, access constraints are certainly shaped by security considerations and the shape of the conflict itself, but access is also shaped by things like weather conditions, the quality of roads, the ability to have alternative roadways, for example. So again, I think access is a really complicated question and depends on a number of factors. I do think the expansion of the technological side of things on the conflict presents maybe not new, but certainly evolving challenges for humanitarian access, particularly in frontline areas. But I also think it begs the question of access in areas that are not necessarily immediate frontline areas, but say 40, 50 kilometers removed from the front line. And we certainly see this with the evolution of the context in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk recently, for example. So I don't have a direct again, I can't predict how access will evolve by the end of 2026 because it is shaped by so many different things. But I think we see an evolving access environment precisely because the nature of warfare, particularly along the front lines, is evolving. And that's something that I think is going to be a continued question throughout 2026. Though how it looks in December 2026, if I had to say today, is a bit unclear to me. So that's like a half answer to the question, I think.
No, thank you for that. And I would also say that obviously we don't have time to go through the entire 30-page report in detail during the limited time that we have. But that question is also kind of dependent on which scenario that you end up in by the end of the year. And so within each of the scenarios, there is a much more granular analysis of frontline locations that I think would help answer that question as well.
And can I just add one thing, because it's in the report, and I mentioned it sort of briefly in the presentation itself, but we have this tendency of thinking about this general tendency, I should say, to think about access from the Ukrainian side to territories currently under the control of the Ukrainian government. But one of the key themes across all the scenarios is that no matter what scenario unfolds, and this is true even in a reduction of hostilities scenario, the access constraints in occupied territories of Ukraine are going to be quite significant no matter what. They may evolve depending on the scenario, but it remains highly, highly constrained. And given what we do know about what's happening in occupied territories, as well as the fact that the information landscape is very limited, we have, there are quite a few limitations in terms of understanding and doing future-focused, forward-looking analysis of how those needs may evolve and change for people living under occupation. So I do want to mention that as well, that's a significant sort of constraint or limitation in terms of doing this kind of scenario analysis in the Ukraine context, because it's hard to anticipate how those needs might evolve given the limited access and the limited informational landscape. And that's just something to keep in mind as we think about scenarios, is I think that's going to be a pretty common theme across the scenarios and no matter what happens.
Absolutely. We have one more question in the chat. So when going through all of the possible future developments, did you consider a black, or in parentheses, total war scenario and its probability?
What do we mean by total war? I guess that's the question for me. So if you want to clarify what you mean by total war, very happy for you to come off mute, please.
Vadim, did you want to add a bit more information?
Maybe they'll add it in the chat, but in the interim, what I'll say is, I mean, the scenarios we've identified are in the realm of plausible and likely from a humanitarian perspective. I think if we're thinking about escalation, certainly, when we say escalating war, it's contextualized in terms of our understanding of what both the Ukrainian military and the Russian military are capable of. In terms of total war, if I had to just imagine what that would be, I don't know that given our understanding of sort of the military and political advantages and constraints, that's necessarily a plausible scenario for 2026. It's certainly not off the table, but that might be what I call, a wild card or black swan type of scenario. But I hope I have understood your question correctly.
Okay, there's a response from Vadim in the chat. So basically throwing all of the weaponry at hand into the fight, so blowing up Zaporizhzhia and BP, or like we've seen with the Kakhovka Dam, etc. So really, it's like a much more serious conflict escalation than we've seen in the last couple of years. I think it's what that question is trying to ask. Yeah. And I would say, yes, we did. Like we did consider all of these. So yes, Vadim is saying that that's the right way to interpret it. We did consider all of these different scenarios. But I think the scenario that we ended up including in the scenario 3, which is the conflict escalation one, is how that would play out in the most realistic sense. And Aditi can probably provide a bit more context to that as well.
And I'll also just come back to like some of our baseline assumptions, right? Because as I said, the baseline assumption really shapes the scenarios. Our baseline assumption is that, fundamentally, Ukraine would have to experience some kind of massive, like military or political collapse that would enable Russian forces to really make sort of significant advances in some way. Now, that doesn't limit their ability to do like a Kakhovka Dam sort of situation, certainly. But again, I come back to what is our baseline assumption? What is the Russian military? What is the Ukrainian military capable of as of our understanding now? Obviously, we don't have a direct line into either military to be able to understand their future capabilities. But then also, again, coming back to what's realistic and plausible and what can humanitarian actors actually plan around. We didn't anticipate a Kahofka Dam situation as far as I know. And so, again, because these things are hard to anticipate, they're hard to plan around and not necessarily something you would build a scenario around. So even while we do consider them, we have to come back to what are we building scenarios for? And that's a way we start to sort of hone in on which scenarios actually matter for humanitarian purposes, at least in this regard. That's not to say it's not important or that we didn't consider it, but we have to come back to why we're doing the scenarios in the first place, as well as those baseline assumptions.
Thank you. Vadim, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, then please feel free to just write in the chat and we're happy to address it. Oh, great. We do still have about 6 minutes left in case there's any final question. Okay. If there's no remaining questions, then maybe we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So first of all, thank you again to Aditi for leading today's presentation. As I said earlier in the webinar, this has really been the result of months of hard work. So I'd also like to thank all of the organizations that joined us in Kyiv in February during the 2 workshops that we held and really contributed to the scenarios themselves, because as I said, this process is led by ACAPS, but the scenarios themselves are co-owned by the entire response. And then lastly, thank you to all of you for joining our session today. We really hope that it was useful for you and the work that you're continuing to do. And I think that's all the time that we have for today, but if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out directly. We do have our hub email address here. And again, the report, which you can access via the QR code here, will go into much more detail than we could cover in the short time that we have together. It does also include a list of indicators, as Aditi mentioned, that you can actively monitor the context over the remainder of the year. So we usually advise people to just print out those last 2 sheets, put them, tape them to your wall so that you can follow along and see which scenario you're most likely approaching. There will be a survey that pops up at the end of the presentation. So we're always looking for ways to improve the way that we work and the way that we do these presentations and webinars. So please just take a couple of minutes to fill out. It only takes about 1 to 2 minutes. But other than that, thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Good luck.